Hi, good evening. I'm Lonnie Stonich, the Executive Director of FAN, and I'm excited to welcome you to tonight's conversation between Robert Frank and David Wallace-Wells. Thanks for attending. FAN's a nonprofit organization that presents a high-quality speaker series offered free to the public on a wide variety of topics, including human development, mental health, education, and social justice, among others. We have over 175 videos of past events archived on our website and our YouTube channel, so please be sure to explore. And now for introductions. Robert Frank is the H.J. Lewis Professor Emeritus of Management and Professor Emeritus of Economics at Cornell's Johnson Graduate School of Management and a Distinguished Senior Fellow at Demos. For more than a decade, his Economic View column appeared monthly in the New York Times. His book, Success and Luck, Good Fortune and the Myth of the Meritocracy, made a big impact on me when I read it several years ago. So we're so glad that he can be here. David Wallace-Wells is an editor-at-large at New York Magazine, where he writes a column on climate change and where his 2017 viral cover story, The Uninhabitable Earth, was met with widespread acclaim, paving the way for his 2019 international best-selling book, The Uninhabitable Earth, Life After Warming. The book was named to the New York Times 100 Notable Books of 2019, GQ's Best Books of 2019, The New Yorker's Favorite Books of 2019, and was chosen as one of Time's 100 must-read books of 2019. How lucky are we to have this wonderful opportunity tonight, and now let's listen and learn.
Well, thank you very much for that introduction. It's really great to be here. It's especially great to be speaking with all of you, and especially great to be speaking with you, Bob, with Robert Frank. We're here to talk about his book, Under the Influence, and especially the ways in which peer pressure can drive progress. Maybe we're going to focus quite a bit on climate change as the challenge there. But Bob, I wanted to just start with the principle in general. Could you open by explaining what social contagion is and what we might miss or have missed in our understanding of recent social history, if we overlook it?
Yeah, I think we've heard the term used mostly in the context of parents telling their children not to follow the dumb examples that their friends set for them. Don't do what the dumb kids are trying to get you to do. The fact is, though, that life's pretty complicated. None of us knows what we need to know to make our way through it, but together we know quite a bit. And if we weren't primed to observe what others do and be influenced by it, then we'd be woefully inequipped even to function. So I think we've got to take cues from others. You've got to be judicious about that. But the fact that we're so heavily influenced by others can be a force for both good and ill. We're most familiar probably with the ways in which kids are led astray by bad examples, but we're less focused on the fact that the things we do are often quite useful to us. You know, the restaurants we pick, the books we read, the films we see, all those things are very heavily socially influenced. And what we have not taken advantage of is the opportunity to try to steer that process for our own advantage. When we've done that, it's been more or less by accident. I know that when we started taxing cigarettes heavily, it was only because there had been studies that came out in Japan that showed that exposure to secondhand smoke was likely to make you more prone to certain illnesses. That was the excuse we needed to discourage smoking. We weren't going to say we want to protect you from harming yourself. That's a no-no. The illnesses that you get from secondhand smoke turn out to be serious, but they're remotely unlikely that you're going to get them from exposure to secondhand smoke. The real harm you do when you smoke is to make other people around you more likely to smoke. And you could say, well, that's their problem. It's their responsibility. But we know that a certain number of people, in addition to the ones who would have smoked anyway, are going to smoke if you smoke. And that's real harm that you cause. And taxing cigarettes had the effect over the decades we've done it. The smoking rate was over half for men when I was a teenager. It's now 13%. And nobody looks back and said, oh, why'd we do that? That's a terrific outcome that that happened because we taxed cigarettes. You can't really justify taxing cigarettes as heavily as we did to prevent secondhand smoke injury, but it's quite easy to justify it by saying that look at all the harm we prevented by discouraging those millions of people from smoking.
Yeah, I mean, the example that comes most clearly to my mind is about the sort of movement on gay marriage, which by the time it became even a debated political point, nationally debated political point in the mid 2000s, and especially by the time it was being knocked through the courts and had already attained so much social momentum that even its opponents felt like they were fighting the tide of history, not
Yes.
And that just goes to show you how much power these things can accumulate even before they sort of attain political salience, especially at the national level.
Yeah, if you look at the polling in the years before the decision from the Supreme Court, it wasn't very many years back that there were very solid majorities vehemently opposed to same-sex marriage. That all changed so quickly, and it's just social influence. Once you start seeing other people who are like you, who think it's okay, then, I mean, there really aren't good arguments against it. And you don't really stop and focus on what the arguments might even be in the first place until you see people starting to shift their own opinions about it. So yeah, it was a hugely contagious process.
So it's an interesting, both of these examples are interesting and illustrative case studies in the sense that they are examples of social change that, in which you could tell the story in terms of the progressive development, how things shifted, how our norms changed. But of course, those forces are acting against other forces, that is, our collective and individual status quo bias, our preference basically to keep things as they are, our reluctance to embrace novelty, and which is itself its own kind of social contagion, right? So we're talking about battles for influence in this sphere, not just how to unleash it in one direction, or that any social contagion will inevitably lead to the kinds of outcomes that at least you and I might celebrate.
Yeah, and no, as we've discussed, some of them are quite bad. The fads and hot memes that people glom onto are very often quite harmful.
So I think that's a useful. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
In the climate domain is where I think we've really got some opportunities. I know as an economist, it had always been my view that, well, we really need robust collective action, massive public investment, carbon taxes, all sorts of policies that will really grab people by the lapels and shake them and get their attention and make them see the world differently, that without that, we're not going to really solve the problem. These individual steps that environmentalists urged on me and others always seemed futile. And so if I ride my bike instead of driving, if I buy a hybrid car, well, that's such a small fraction of the total problem. It's not going to, if everybody else did it, that'd be great. Then I wouldn't have to do it. If I do it, nobody else does, then what's the difference? I completely changed my mind about all that in the process of working on this book. And that was, I think, one of the biggest surprises to me. We really underestimate the impact that things that we individually might do will have ultimately. I think the example of solar panel adoption is probably the most vivid case in point for that. There's a great study in California. There's a new installation at time zero. 4 months later, they can control for all the other things that influence new installations. 4 months later, we get a copycat, not one that would have happened anyway without that first one, but one that happened because of that one. So for time zero, we got one. 4 months later, we got two. Each one of those then spawns one. So after 8 months, we've got four.
And just to interrupt, this is when you say control, just to be clear, this means independent of any tax incentives, any cost. This is
Exactly.
purely the effect of social influence.
Yeah, the first one might have been influenced by an incentive program that was in effect. When that first one's there, holding everything else constant, the mere fact that it was there led to the second one. There would be other ones happening too because of the same reasons that led that first one to happen, but there'll be an additional one over and above that first one just because somebody saw it and was prompted to do it. So after just 2 years with that doubling every 4 months, we've got 32 installations in that one zip code. And that's not even taking any account of the fact that they've got friends and relatives in other zip codes whom they probably influence even more heavily than their neighbors right around them. It's an amazingly powerful effect. You buy a Prius, the distinctive shape of the car, let everybody know it was a hybrid car. The Civic had a hybrid version too, but it looked the same as the gas engine version. The Prius sold enormously many more copies than the Honda version of the hybrid car, and it was just because people were influenced by seeing that others had them. So that's the first observation that led me to think individual action wasn't quite as futile as I had once thought it was. But I think there's a more important dimension to this, which is that when you do those sorts of things, it changes who you are. Economists assume people come into the world fully formed with identities and preferences. No, that's not how it works at all, really. Aristotle had it much more accurately. He said we become who we are in the process of doing what we do. And so when you take these steps, when you put a solar panel on your rooftop, when you buy a hybrid car, when you start eating less meat, all those things change who you are. And they make you much more likely to support the kind of candidates who will take the collective actions that we really do need to take. So I think for those two independent pathways, really the individual actions that we could take in the climate domain are vastly more consequential than I ever realized. And that's a liberating feeling. I mean, I think I'm much more eager to advocate on behalf of things like that when I know that they actually could make a difference.
And when you know that there are others out there who share some of your impulses, preferences, and goals,
Exactly.
It's not just that you can trigger someone else to adopt the same, buy the same car, or cut their meat consumption, or whatever the case may be. It's that you're helping build a community of like-minded citizens
Exactly.
who will then feel much more empowered, even independent of what political influence they may yield, just by the fact that they know they're not alone, and they may have for a long time felt that they were quite alone.
And that's how political movements happen.
Right. So talking about climate in particular, the way that you just talked about all of these effects, all of these sort of exhilarating developments over the last decade, makes me think of social contagion as a sort of a steroid for climate policy. That is to say, it can accelerate, deepen, intensify the impacts of what policy does. But you've also talked about it as a sort of an independent lever or path for change. And of course, it as you were just saying a few minutes ago, it helps add to multiply the effect at the individual level. So how should we think about it so much of climate politics has been about this sort of false binary that you talked about, the individual level, what can we do? How can I cut my carbon footprint? At the grand social and political level, like how can we change our national policies? How precisely should we think about these forces? Are they a connector between those two distinct fields? How do you think about all three of those categories and how exactly they fit together in an optimal climate policy framework?
I think for most people, and I would count myself in this larger group, there's not a sense that you're really in a position to influence public policy. I don't know Chuck Schumer. Even if I did know Chuck Schumer and could get an hour with him, I'm not sure I could persuade him to do anything that he wasn't going to do anyway. I think most people don't feel like they have any levers to pull that would influence public policy, but the one thing you can do for sure is take the small steps that are open to individuals. And I think realizing that they're not isolated and they're not confined just to you alone is an energizing sense that pushes you to take those steps. You think about diet. You know, I'm not a vegetarian, but I do care about the climate. I do think I ought to eat less meat than I do, and I have been eating less meat than I do. And part of it is that you grow up in a certain environment. You know, my parents ate meat. We had meat at every meal. We feel embarrassed if we would have guests over. If we didn't serve meat, we would worry that they would think we weren't taking their presence seriously. We weren't willing to spend a little extra to give them a nice meal. But as these things change, even in the slightest ways, they tend to feed on themselves. I mean, maybe we'll have dinner with a friend and we'll have a vegetarian meal, and we'll discover that there's a dish that, wow, that tasted better than anything I've eaten in a month, and it didn't have any meat in it. And so now what's the recipe for that? And it spreads in that way, one step at a time, in a way that I think people find empowering. And as those things spread, then they find their way into the political domain too. People become active. They find out the website of a candidate who's promising to do something about it. They write a check. They knock on doors. All those things have a chain reaction effect to them.
Yeah, so that all seems very exciting. It's a sort of a long arc of history. View of or the whatever the line is, that the moral arc of history bends towards justice. View of all of these problems. And I think to some degree it feels intuitive that when we think about not just the individual level changes that you're talking about, but even the social and political level changes, even at the international level, if we imagine the planet 100 years from now, 150 years from now, it's sort of hard to imagine a world in which we haven't figured most of this stuff out and sorted most of its stuff out, given a long enough timeline.
If the world's around, then we almost have to have figured it out.
But in order to make that happen, we need to move relatively quickly
yes.
and aggressively in the short term. And that's, I think, one complicating factor in some of these stories is, if we're talking about, meaningfully trying to stabilize the world's temperature well below 2 degrees Celsius of warming, which is what the UN says we need to do. And now all of the world's leaders have agreed, aiming to keep it as low as 1.5 degrees, those efforts do require, according to those same scientists, something like a halving of emissions over the next decade. And while social contagion certainly can play a role there, and as I was saying earlier, and you were saying, can amplify and extend the impact of climate policy, one question I have is, how quickly can all that happen? I mean, if is it, certainly it's not sufficient, we can't just forget about policy and just depend on social contagion to get us out of this mess. But is this sort of effect compatible with the sort of rapid timelines, the urgent timelines that we've been asked to take seriously by the people who take climate change most seriously? How do you think about those issues?
Yeah, I think it is doable. I mean, partly the reason I think it's doable is that I read a really good book a couple of years ago. And as you wrote in The Uninhabitable Earth, if we don't do this, it will be because we chose not to. I think the real danger is that a lot of people feel that it's too late, that we've already used up our carbon budget and the world's going to go to hell anyway, so let's party on, there's no point. That's not the way you read the evidence. That's not the way I read it. however you read the evidence, the expenditures we have to make if we're going to do this in time are massive. They're not small budget outlays. They're huge budget outlays. And the fact is, you can do some calculations. We have made outlays on that scale many times in the past, not many times, but on multiple occasions in the past, maybe most recently during World War II. No one suffered any sense of extreme deprivation because much of the national output was going into the production of war-related goods, much less into consumption goods. We can do that. The contribution that Contagion makes to this argument is that we can do it in ways that are much, much easier than anybody dared think. And the argument's actually fairly simple. What we feel we need is very socially conditioned. I was a Peace Corps volunteer decades ago. I lived in rural Nepal for 2 years. There I lived in a 2-room house that had no electricity or running water. There wasn't a day I lived in that house that it didn't seem completely satisfactory. You wouldn't feel it was a satisfactory house if you lived in it in an American city. I wouldn't either. My kids would have been ashamed for their friends to see where we lived if we lived in a house like that. But there it was completely adequate. And there's a huge literature on the determinants of human flourishing. It's large, it's contentious, but there's a very well-documented set of findings in it. And that's that beyond a certain point, in many, many forms of consumption, it's a point we've long since passed here in the West, further increases across the board. So if all the mansions get 10% bigger, all the cars get 10% heavier, all the destinations get 10% more exotic. The only effect of that is to raise the bar that defines what we think of as adequate. And what
I think, oh, sorry, go ahead.
What that means is that if we siphon the resources away from the top, there's a great Oxfam study. 50% of all CO2 emissions are the responsibility of the top 10% of earners worldwide. So if we could just take resources away from the people at the top, that would mean their consumption wouldn't grow as fast as it's been growing in the past years, and that wouldn't hurt them one bit. They'd be just as happy as before. And in the meantime, their property would be protected against these devastating storms and fires that is threatening them more than anybody else right now in the first place.
Yeah, I mean, I because I'm a lifelong New Yorker, I tend to think of these things in terms of New York City real estate, which is, an overwhelming concern for people in New York. And, the truth is that even billionaires live in New York in apartments that are much smaller than middle-class people, the houses that middle-class people live in most of the rest of the country. And yet they're very happy in those footprints because it makes them feel that they're incredibly large compared to the apartment that I live in Lower Manhattan. And it does show how flexible some of those standards are and how much of our anxiety about consumption is really about relative status rather than sort of absolute levels of consumption.
Right, and a carbon tax is maybe the most salient example of political malpractice I've ever seen in my lifetime. People say we need a carbon tax. Economists have been arguing for this for decades. If we'd had one from the very first time this issue hit our radar screens, we wouldn't need to talk about any other steps. It would all have been dealt with automatically by people responding to a carbon tax. But the politicians, for some reason, didn't see fit to stress that the tax could be made revenue neutral. That is to say, we put on a stiff carbon tax. All the carbon heavy footprint goods get more expensive relative to other goods. We collect all of that carbon tax revenue, and then each month we send back a rebate check. A progressive rebate scheme would probably be the one I'd favor. So middle and low income families get rebate checks. 90% of all taxpayers would get a rebate check each month that was bigger than what they'd paid that month in carbon taxes. So how could you not sell a policy like that? The only people who'd be paying net each month would be the people at the top, and they've got more than they need anyway, and are not going to feel any sense of deprivation if they don't see their mansions grow as fast as they're used to seeing them grow. If the others aren't growing, then yours doesn't need to grow either, because you don't need to entertain in the style that's expected in your circle.
I want to get to the points that you're raising. I mean, I know you have some slides that are relevant to share about the sort of how significant the burden or insignificant the burden of the costs of climate action would be. But just to pause on something you said a minute ago about, you know, the rate at which the size of their mansions are growing. In some fundamental human moral way, I look at a lot of the consumption of the extremely rich, and it seems completely unnecessary, explained by status hierarchies and competition, but not necessary, and you know, kind of horrifying and destructive given the state of the planet and what's required to maintain those accelerating growth trajectories of consumption among the very wealthy. On the other hand, I also look at American politics, Western politics more generally, and see huge amounts of turmoil and disruption when economic growth rates fall even very slightly. You know, when we're talking about annual GDP growth of 1.8 as opposed to 2.2%, it does really seem to produce quite a lot of you know, social frustration and enemy. So how do we think about these two things at the same time? The fact that we know a lot of this consumption is unnecessary, but also that we are so addicted to growth as growth that when it doesn't arrive as we expect it to, we're very frustrated.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think the environmental movement, many in it, have made a mistake by declaring themselves to be anti-growth. Growth is not the problem. What's the problem is growth in certain kinds of consumption and other activities that yield emissions that trap heat in the atmosphere. That's the problem. If my wife takes piano lessons, that adds to GDP, that there's nothing external that happens bad to anybody as a result of that. If we plant a nicer garden, that's fine too. All sorts of things we can do that don't harm anybody else. There's no reason to discourage those. And in fact, when income grows less rapidly, we know that public policy gets much less generous. We're much less willing to invest in the public sphere. We spend less effort on social justice measures. The whole across the board kinds of policies that you and I would both favor take a big hit when growth rates go down. Growth is good. It's growth in certain kinds of things that's bad. And to steer growth, it's necessary to penalize consumption of the things that cause harm to us and others, and leave the things that don't cause harm alone. So I think, yeah, we don't want to come out against growth. And I think even I rethink my reaction to wag my finger at the people who build these unnecessarily big mansions in the following sense. If my friends, they think I'd taken complete leave of my senses. Why would anybody need such a grand house as that? Why so many bathrooms? What's the problem there? They would want to know. But you wouldn't think that. My friends here don't think that. If they have any comment about my houses, why do I live in a house that's smaller than the houses that many of my colleagues who earn less than I do are living in? That's the anomaly here. So people like nice things, and if you're used to a small house and you get a bigger one, that feels good. You shouldn't look down on people for that human reaction to, I mean, nice is just a relative concept. What's true is that when we all build bigger, nobody's any happier than before. There's just a disjunction between individual and collective interest on issues like this. You know, if we all drove 2,000-pound cars, we'd be just as happy and safer than if we all drove 6,000-pound cars. But if I buy a 6,000-pound car and everybody else has a 2,000, I'm much safer than they are. And that's a good thing. I like that. But then they build bigger, and then we're all less safe than we were before. Taxing cars by weight, what a good idea that would be.
Well, it does suggest another use of social contagion, which is not just to promote good behavior, but also to sanction below the level of public policy or tax policy bad behavior.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah. So
Yeah.
let's talk about the big picture and your sense of the sort of costs and benefits of action. You know, for a long time we've heard about climate action as being burdensomely expensive and a sort of moral obligation, perhaps, but not one that would be all that appealing. And as a result, it was, you know, especially at the geopolitical level, something in which, you know, nations only wanted to move if all of their peers were also moving in the same direction. Nobody wanted to take the first step. Nobody wanted to be a climate leader. They thought it would be, you know, a damper on economic activity. That's not how I see the question. That's, I think, an increasingly no longer the case that's how most economists see that equation. But I know that you have a pretty focused sense of exactly how we should be thinking about these questions, and wanted to kick that to you. Like, how should we be thinking about the costs and benefits of climate action and you know, what it would take to raise the revenue that we need to kickstart the transition that we need?
The objection that I think has caused the most damage is that this is a global problem. The CO2 disperses uniformly around the planet. If we take action, we're just a tiny fraction of the total. It's not going to make a difference. Why should we give up our standard of living when it won't make any difference? I think that's wrong-headed, certainly for countries like the US and Europe. People will say, well, if India doesn't do it, if China doesn't do it, what's the point? The World Trade Organization has already voiced its receptiveness to cross-border tariffs. So if we put on a stiff carbon tax, we tax goods according to their carbon footprints here, and goods produced in China and India are not taxed in that way, and then they try to export those goods to the US or to Europe, the World Trade Organization would be very receptive to us slapping a cross-border tariff on those goods. So we would collect the carbon tax they didn't levy at home on their production. Why would they sit back and watch us take the revenue from that tax when they have the option of putting that tax on their own goods before they ship them here? If they did that, then we couldn't tax them here. That would be considered a violation of trade agreements. So we can all be on, you know, we have levers to pull that will make it in every major country's interest to fall in line about regulating emissions. We need to take steps to curtail emissions. We can take them, and if others don't take them, we can deny them access to markets that they really depend critically on having access to.
And how should we, do you want to walk through your slides on some related subjects? Is that a good time for that?
Yeah, well, this has been a problem for me for decades. I've been arguing, based on this literature I mentioned earlier, that if consumption grows beyond a certain point, all that does is raise the bar that defines adequate. If we would tax ourselves more heavily, those of us near the top of the income ladder, and spend that money on public investments, we would lose nothing from the slowdown in the rate of growth of consumption that we would experience, because when we all slow down in tandem, that doesn't hurt us, but we would benefit enormously from the investments. That's been my argument. I've been making it for 30 years. I've gotten virtually nowhere with it. And so finally, none too soon, had the wit to ask myself, well, why aren't people voting for politicians who will do this if I'm right? This is a version of the, if you're so smart, how come you're not rich question. Why didn't I think to tackle that question earlier? Well, finally, I started thinking about it. Let me show you where I came out on this, if I can figure out how to do it. Now, I hope I've succeeded in putting the question on there. So if the the losses in the consumption domain when we pay higher taxes wouldn't hurt and we would benefit from the investments, why don't we vote for politicians who will do that? My claim is that the people at the top resist taxes on themselves because they suffer from what I'm calling the mother of all cognitive illusions. I'll say just a quick word about cognitive illusions generally. This is one. I'll ask, which square looks darker to you, the one labeled A or B? Notice I didn't ask which one is darker, which one looks darker. If your brain is functioning normally, well, which one looks darker to you, David?
Well, I mean, I'll take the bait and say that A looks darker than B, although I'm guessing that the correct answer is that B looks darker than A.
The two squares are exactly the same shade of gray, so that's the trick. You know it's a trick, so you're reluctant to say that A looks darker, but if A doesn't look darker, then something's going amiss in your brain. You should have a meeting with your neurologist.
No, A definitely looks darker to me. I just was thinking one step ahead.
So the psychologists explain this illusion. They say, well, the light from A and B enter our eyes with the same intensity. It goes to the visual processing centers. It's all the same there. But there's an additional piece of information the brain has, which is that square B lies in the shadow of the cylinder. And we know that things in shadow are actually lighter than they appear to be. So the brain, on the fly, unbidden, produces an automatic adjustment in your perception and tells you that B is lighter than A. I thought that sounded like a great explanation, but then I looked at the diagram again. I said, no, that still can't be right. B can't be the same. And then I I got my graphics program out and I made a strip that was the same shade as B, and I joined it to A, and sure enough, there just is no distinguishable difference in those two shades. So there are illusions. You know, the world's complicated. The brain's doing the best it can. It relies on shortcuts and heuristics to tell you what's going on out there. If it didn't do that, you'd be way ill-equipped to make your way. So that's an illusion, and I spend a minute on it just to make it seem plausible that a sentence could sound undoubtedly true and yet be false. So here's the rich. He wants to know how this tax proposed by Frank is going to affect him. And so the natural cognitive strategy is to say, all right, he's going to raise my taxes. How did I feel the last time that happened? If he felt okay about it, they said he won't resist the proposal. If he didn't like it, then he will. This strategy doesn't work in the current environment because if you're a rich person in the Western world, your taxes have been going down steadily. So in World War II in the US, they were 92% at the top. When I graduated from Georgia Tech in 1966, they'd fallen to 70% and down with a couple of almost imperceptible increases along the way. You can't use that heuristic. How did I feel about higher taxes? Because my tax rates never have gone up before in any appreciable sense. So you go to plan B. I know higher taxes mean I'll have less money to spend. How did I feel the last time I had less money to spend? And unless you're a really charmed life, there will be times like that. You will remember them. Maybe you had a bad business year. Maybe you had a divorce. You had less money then. A home fire, that'll do it too. A health crisis. Maybe your son got arrested for a serious crime. Maybe you had to hire a really expensive attorney. You remember all these times. They're all very accessible memories. You felt horrible each one of those times. Your income's going to go down if they raise your taxes. I don't want that to happen, so I'm going to lobby as far as I can to prevent it. And they have lobbied hard, and they have prevented. They've actually not only prevented their taxes from going up, they've caused them to go down over the years. What are they really worried about, though? What they're worried about is not being able to buy the things they want, the special extras. So here's what the people in your pond want, David. They want a penthouse apartment overlooking the park.
That's very nice.
There aren't very many of those. Of course, it would be nice to have one. How do you get those? You have to outbid other people like you who want them. And your ability to do that depends only on your relative bidding power. And this just in, your relative bidding power is completely unaffected. If your taxes go up and the taxes of people like you go up too, your relative bidding power is exactly the same as it was before. And then exactly the same people end up with the choice apartments as before. So we could tax the people at the top who've got just boatloads of money to finance the grid improvements we need to make, the charging networks, all the new machines that can suck carbon out of the air. I sent you a copy of a piece I did. It was about Climeworks, the Swiss company's new installation in Iceland. It's a carbon capture and storage technology. Huge fans blow the air over these filters. They trap carbon. They precipitate it out. Then they heat it up to a high temperature, and they make it into a slurry. They pump it way below the earth. It hardens there into rock, and it never bothers us ever again. We could put these machines all over the deserts of the world. We could power them with solar energy. We could suck all the carbon we need to out of the air to address the climate goals that we're trying to meet. It's only money. And I calculated that at the projected cost of these machines, it would take about 1.8% of world GDP each year to pay for the machines necessary to suck all the carbon out of the air that we need to suck out. And that would be like missing out on 1 year of economic growth. It's a rounding error. We could do this. So I think the pessimism, the feeling that it's too late, it's going to be too expensive, there's no way we could tackle all this, that's just the wrong perception of the nature of the problem. And I think if more people knew that, we'd be more likely to take the actions that we need to take. So that's the good news part of the message. And I think, I'm eager for more people to hear it.
I mean, I think there's a way in which we've sort of lost the opportunity to avoid the impacts of climate change. Dangerous climate change is already here, and we will inevitably be living with it for decades to come, at the very least, maybe centuries or millennia, depending on how many negative emissions machines like the ones you're talking about we use. But of course, there's a huge difference between 1.8 degrees and 2.2 degrees and 2.8 degrees and 3.4 degrees and 3.4 degrees and 4.2 degrees. And at no level of warming does it make sense for us collectively to say it's too late, because there will always be a difference that can be made by taking action to reduce carbon emissions in the near term. So I want to table for a second your thoughts about carbon capture, which I do think we should go into in a little more detail in a minute, and just ask as a more directed follow-up from your brief slide presentation about, a lot of that is, can we afford it, in the sense of, will it be a big deal if we raise taxes on people to pay for it? But of course, there's also the more direct assessment, calculation of cost benefit, like, will these measures be an economic burden to us, or will they bring us to a medium-term future in which we are collectively better off and look back at those as not costs, but investments? How do you see that set of questions?
Yeah, I think from all I've read, if we completely make the transition to renewable energy has gotten cheaper faster than anybody dared dream. Energy experts were asked to forecast what electricity would cost 10 years from now, 10 years ago, and they estimated that it would be much more expensive than it was 2 years later. It's just falling way faster than anybody dreamed. So we can electrify pretty much everything. We can use energy that we produce that way to make hydrogen for certain kind of transportation uses that are difficult to electrify. Maybe planes are harder to deal with that way. But there are practical ways to do this. Yeah, I'm convinced that it's only money, and we've got way more money than we need to do it.
So, we've talked for a long time tonight about the force of social contagion, the factors or drivers that seem to be pointing in some positive directions on climate change. And I want to just ask you sort of big picture, like, where are we in this story? Like, obviously, we can say now in a way that we couldn't have said maybe 10 or 15 years ago that we're moving in the right direction, that a lot of these things are pointing positively. But of course, the question of where on that social transition, political transition, economic transition, technological transition, where exactly we are on that curve is hugely important, in part because it affects whether we get to 1.8 or 2.4 to blah, blah, blah. So where do you see our place in that timeline? And maybe as a sort of related follow-up, how do you see the role of carbon capture and negative emissions? And how does that change, how does that or should that change our sense of those timelines?
Yeah, I think I have the same sense of urgency you do. And I was extremely depressed in the wake of the 2020 elections, when the people who were concerned about climate in the House lost ground. We lost seats there when you're counting votes for meaningful climate change. And it looked like the Senate, there had seemed to be a good chance that the Senate would change hands, in which case there was a real prospect of taking action. Then it looked like this Senate, in fact, wouldn't change hands. I was so excited January 5th when the Senate did flip. And then, of course, the people who wanted climate action were really, really about to celebrate the passage of the Build Back Better Act. And then it became clear that we were a couple of senators short in the end. So I think I've had several people ask me, because they know I work on climate issues, what's the most important climate thing I can, these are people with means, where should we make our donations? And I say, donate to the candidates who are going to take action on this. That's the very most important way to spend money in the next round on any of this. The Virginia houses of delegates flipped in the 2018 election for the first time. Virginia passed one of the most sweeping green energy bills of any state in the wake of that happening. It was just a couple of seats. They weren't that costly to flip. There are ways to do this, but we got to elect the right people. I think if we elect the right people, we're on the cusp of very rapid change. You don't need a lot of incentives when it's cheaper to run renewable energy than it is to operate, to actually build renewables from scratch. The cost of producing energy that way is cheaper than the marginal cost of just running an existing fossil fuel plant now. So people are going to be rushing to switch just because of the economic incentives, but we've got a lot of investment to make, and a lot of that has to be public. So we're going to need a lot of money, but we have a lot of money. We can spend it if we're willing to.
And how big a part of the solution in your mind is carbon capture in its various forms?
I always thought I knew a lot about this until I read your book. And I realized I really hadn't scratched the surface of it. The people I read seem, many of them, not to want to talk about carbon capture, because they fear that if people think that that's a possibility, then people will think, oh, well, we don't have to do the hard stuff. We can just sit back and wait for somebody to build these machines that suck carbon out of the air. But then I read the see reports that say that even if we get emissions down to zero in 20 years, if we don't suck carbon out of the air in massive quantities, we're going to have temperature rises that are well past anything I'd want my descendants to have to live through. So I think we absolutely need to suck carbon out of the air. I'm thrilled that there are technologies coming online that seem to be able to do this. The energy they need in order to do it is a hurdle, but there are vast areas of the planet that are deserts that don't have much in the way of alternative uses. The air distributes itself uniformly all over the Earth's surface. So if we suck carbon out in the desert, it's going to eventually reduce the concentration everywhere. So yeah, I think full speed ahead on that. If we can get the politicians to vote for it, we're good to go.
And to fund it, I guess, since we don't really have a path to a market system that would incentivize it, right?
No, we can reduce emissions by putting insulation into buildings at about $15 a ton. We can get carbon out of the air. The projected cost after another decade or so of this Climeworks machine is something like $100 a ton. So it's not the best way to get carbon out of the air. And to reduce emissions in the atmosphere now, it's the best way to get carbon that's already up there out. And we do need to do that, no matter if we get emissions all the way down to zero. So it's not something we can say, oh, let's just insulate the buildings. That's not going to get us where we need to get to.
Well, I think we're about to move on to a few questions before we go. But before we do that, I just wanted to thank you, Bob, for all of your time and your wisdom and your great book. It's been a great privilege talking to you, and I hope everyone in the audience has enjoyed it, and hope we get some good questions.
I'm sure we will. And this is the book that got me really revved up to work as much as I've been working on this in the years since it came out. If you haven't seen this book, you really do need to get it and read it.
Excellent. Thank you, David. Thank you for a great interview with Bob. It was very helpful. There are a lot of great questions coming in. Bob, thank you so much for your time. I want to remind everyone that Bob is going to be sticking around for after hours. The way that you get access to it is by purchasing a copy of his book. You can get it. We've been putting links in chat. So, and maybe we'll throw in one more before we close out here so that you can buy. When we close the Zoom at 8, we're going to give Bob a 5-minute bio break, and then we'll open up that room. After hours is a Zoom meeting. You can ask your own questions. It's relaxed. It's fun. So please do come join us. There's a couple questions. I'm going to start with the crowd favorite from Emily. She says, isn't the greatest obstacle right now that most people do not know how dire the threats of climate change are? How do we put peer pressure to work at creating a critical mass of voters who believe urgent climate action is the most important issue of our time?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think this question would have been more timely 3 years ago. I think with the California wildfires, then the Australia wildfires, the worldwide droughts, the violent storms, the flooding, all that has been so vividly in the news the last 2 or 3 years that there are many fewer people now than there were 3 years ago who are thinking that this is not a problem that we need desperately quickly to deal with. We had a senator bringing a snowball onto the Senate floor as if that was proof that climate change was a myth. That senator wouldn't dare do that today. I think the market for that kind of nonsense is dried up.
David, did you want any comment on that? Well, I think Bob is absolutely right that the trends are moving in the right direction. That the concern is that they're not moving quite fast enough. And I think as someone who's concerned about climate, on just about every point, that's the story. And it's hard to keep both of those perspectives in mind at once, but that is the only way to really see clearly the situation. The world is moving. Concern is growing up to and including the highest levels of power, in the Davos sphere and the geopolitical world. But even so, we're not moving fast enough. And the question, I think, is how do we get from where we are now, where we have millions of climate strikers in the streets and climate anxiety polls, in the 60s, 70s, 80s in many Western countries, And yet our politicians are still acting like we've got more like 50 years rather than 20 years to really get a hold of the problem. I think Bob's right that the natural disasters that we see are tragically doing some of that work for us. I think that the activism of many of the climate groups that I mentioned, the climate strikers led by Greta, but also Extinction Rebellion, at least in their first year or so, and Sunrise in the US and many others have made a huge difference there, but it's not enough. And I think a lot of it comes down to the social contagion factors that Bob is talking about. Not enough people are talking about climate in their daily lives. Not enough people are expressing their own climate anxiety, even to their loved ones. And it may feel like a small thing, but at an individual level, just doing that, just expressing your concern can really level up the social pressure to the people who really matter.
The film, Don't Look Up, I think helped stimulate the conversation more than any other recent event I can think of.
There's a question here from Jim. He thanks you both for a great session. He says Australia just announced this week that one of the major coal power plants will be phased out 7 years earlier than scheduled, and that the provider had stated the reality is the economics of coal-fired power stations are being put under increasing unsustainable pressure by cleaner and lower cost generation, including solar, wind, and batteries. Now his question is, in addition to electing officials who understand climate issues, how do we amplify the message that energy providers are making the transition? Carbon capture technology exists. We have solutions at hand to address this slow-moving problem. So his question is, how do you amplify the message?
Well, maybe you become an editor of New York Magazine and you write another viral article that gets that message out there.
I think a lot of that is the most important people for whom it, the most important people to hear that message are the economic decision makers, actually, more than the public, which is to say, chiefly banks and other financial institutions who are lending huge sums of money to the oil and gas business to expand operations and do new exploration. There are some pinch points there. And the more that those decision makers understand the non-viability of especially new fossil infrastructure, the harder it's going to be for those things to be built. The retirement of existing infrastructure, I think, is a politically thornier problem. But I do think, especially as we see more clearly, and the thing I would really emphasize in messaging, see more clearly, the public health effects of burning fossil fuels are so catastrophically bad and far-reaching and everywhere on the world. The more that we understand those clearly, I think the political pressure to shut down some of those facilities and really scale up our renewable capacity will grow even more. I think almost no one on the planet really understands just how bad burning coal in particular really is for you, but it's absolutely abysmal. And the more that we can spread the word about that, the faster those dirty sources are going to be retired. In the same way that, we didn't live with burning rivers in the 1970s, we're not going to be living with burning coal in the 2030s.
Great point.
Yeah, and to that point, both Michelle and Cheryl mentioned, Michelle said, she thinks that people can have an effect on policy by calling their elected officials, and Cheryl's saying, yeah, and it's also probably a good idea to encourage people to vote. Would be a great first local step. So we're right at 8 o'clock. David, thank you so much for your time tonight. We appreciate you coming and joining us in Fanland. We hope to have you back again. Bob, you get a nice 5-minute break. Everybody, we hope to see you at After Hours.